Ukraine is a country that is no stranger to mass population decline and shifts. Within the past century, the country has been at the forefront of famines and two major world wars. Let's start with World War One. The territory we now know as Ukraine was divided up between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Empire, which saw hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians conscripted into opposing militaries. Estimating the population at this time is very difficult, as the country as we know it today was divided up between two separate entities and didn't hold its own census. Still, based on historical data and by combining the censuses of both the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Empire, we can reasonably assume that the population within the modern territory of Ukraine stood at around 29 to 35 million at the start of World War I. The war itself, and the subsequent events of the Ukrainian War of Independence, the Spanish flu pandemic, and then couple this with the wider Russian Civil War, took a heavy toll on the population, which saw the population decline to around 26 to 30 million going into the 1920s. As Ukraine was incorporated into the wider Soviet Union during the 1920s, the country was recorded within the first all-Soviet census, which took place in 1926. This census placed the population of Ukraine at around 28.9 million at the time of counting, with the population beginning to recover slightly from the upheaval of World War I and the past decade. Then we enter the 1930s. To put it bluntly, the 1930s devastated Ukraine. Soviet policies were particularly harsh to the nation, as Stalin's policy of forced collectivization aimed to consolidate individual landholdings and labour into collective farms known as kolkhiks. This policy was met with resistance throughout the Soviet Union, but especially in Ukraine, which was one of the more agriculturally productive regions in the Soviet Union. The process led to widespread disruption of agricultural production, forced displacement of peasants, and a significant loss of life due to repression and executions of those resisting collectivization. Stalin also led policies which saw thousands of intellectuals, political leaders, and ordinary citizens arrested, executed, or sent to labour camps. By far the worst impact of the population, however, was the Holodomor famine. The famine was largely a result of the Soviet government's policies under Stalin, particularly forced collectivization, which disrupted agricultural production. The Soviet state imposed excessive grain requisition quotas on Ukrainian farmers, seizing their crops and leaving them with insufficient food to survive. Famine was exacerbated by Stalin's desire to suppress Ukrainian nationalism and resistance to Soviet policies. Authorities refused to provide aid and sealed off borders to prevent people from fleeing or receiving help. It is estimated that around 3 to 4 million people died as a result of the Holodomor, though some estimates go higher than that. By the 1940s, Ukraine's population had partially recovered from the severe demographic impacts of the 1930s. This was also aided with the addition of the Western territories and the national increase in population growth, aided by the growth of major cities throughout the country. But then another major war devastated the country. The country before Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, had a population that stood at around 40 million. However, World War II devastated the country, as Ukraine was at the forefront of a Nazi invasion, occupation, and then the Soviet counter-offensive. It is estimated that at least 16.3% of the population died during the war, which translates to around 6.8 million people, although estimates go as high as 8 million people. Population, now devastated by the war, began to slowly recover. Across Europe and the wider world, a baby boom was underway, and Ukraine also experienced this phenomenon. The fertility rate during the 1950s and into the 1960s in Ukraine was estimated to be around 3.2 live births per woman, which is significantly high, and basically unheard of now in Europe. This is also combined with Soviet state-led encouragement of settlement into Ukraine from other parts of the Soviet Union, particularly in the country's many increasingly industrialized cities. As a result, many of the major cities of Ukraine grew rapidly throughout the 1950s and over a number of decades well into the 1980s. Finally, the general cultural acceptance in Ukraine to have a large family throughout the 1950s and into the 1990s saw the population also continue to grow. Throughout the entire Cold War period, despite uncertainties, nuclear disasters, and Soviet repression, the population continued growing and reached a peak of around 52.1 million in 1993. From then on, the population year on year began to decline and continues to decline to this very day. Let's stay in the 1990s. The Soviet Union collapses, and now Ukraine is independent, but the transition away from the Soviet Union is troublesome. Markets collapsed, and the economic shock of independence resulted in widespread unemployment, inflation, and poverty. These economic difficulties discouraged people from having larger families. This helped result in the total fertility rate of Ukraine falling beneath 2.1 live births per woman. When this happens, it is generally accepted that the population will begin to decline, and in the case of Ukraine, and most Eastern European countries to be fair, will begin to age. Many Ukrainians, particularly younger working age people, left the country in search of better opportunities abroad, further reducing the population. This is a phenomenon not unique to Ukraine, as it occurs and continues to occur across Eastern European countries, but that is also the focus of a future video. As the country progresses, it further urbanizes, and younger people in rural areas head to the cities. On average, younger people living in cities have fewer children than in rural areas. The increased female participation in the workforce further results in fewer children being born in the country. Political instability highlighted by the Orange Revolution in 2004 and the continued corruption by state institutions in the country further dissuaded younger people from having children. These factors also pushed many younger citizens to emigrate elsewhere. In the year 2000, the population of Ukraine stood at around 49 million, which actually ranked Ukraine ahead of Spain and Poland by total population at the time. Ukraine was the world's 25th most populous nation. Fast forwarding a decade to the year 2010, and the population had fallen to 45 million, a decline of nearly 9%, and Ukraine slips to become the world's 28th most populous nation at the time. Let's look at the next decade in the country, which sees a further acceleration of emigration as young people continue leaving the country to a significant degree. This further results in significant brain drain. Brain drain being a phenomenon that occurs when large segments of the educated population leave the country for opportunities abroad. This in turn leads to shortages of the skills they bring with them in their home countries. We also see significant events that alter the population. Firstly, the Euromaidan protest, which began in late 2013. This led to significant political upheaval, culminating in the ousting of President Yanukovych in 2014. The internal upheaval caused by the protests creates the opportunity for Russia to annex Crimea, and with it a population of 2.1 million citizens. The annexation also caused significant displacement, with many Ukrainians fleeing Crimea for other parts of Ukraine or abroad. The war in eastern Ukraine also kicks off, particularly in the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. The war in eastern Ukraine leads to a significant loss of life, the displacement of populations, and economic devastation. Over 1.5 million people were internally displaced, and many others fled to neighbouring countries, which further reduced the population. The population, as a result of all of these events, was not uniform across the country. Some regions, particularly those closer to the conflict zones, of course experienced sharper declines. Conversely, parts of western Ukraine, closer to the European Union, saw more modest declines. In the year 2020, Ukraine had a population of around 41.2 million. This does not include Crimea. However, if we do add Crimea, the population of Ukraine will be around 43 million. Even with Crimea, the country still falls on the list of the world's most populous countries, dropping to 34th. And now finally we come to 2022, and the full invasion of Ukraine by Russia. The war has caused one of the largest displacement crises in Europe since World War II. Millions of Ukrainians have been forced to flee their homes due to the fighting, with many seeking refuge in safer regions within Ukraine and also in other countries in Europe. As of 2023, estimates suggest that around 5.1 million people were internally displaced within Ukraine. In addition to internal displacement, a significant number of Ukrainians have fled to neighbouring countries, particularly Poland, Romania, Hungary, and other European Union states. By the end of 2022, more than 8 million Ukrainians have been registered as refugees in various countries across Europe. Although the total number of refugees today still outside of Ukraine in other European countries is estimated to be around 6.5 million. Overall, Ukraine has fallen behind Poland in terms of population. Birth rates in Ukraine have plummeted since the onset of the war. The uncertainty and instability caused by the conflict has led many families to postpone or decide against having children. The stress of war, combined with the economic hardship of a wartime economy and the displacement of millions, has created an environment where fewer births are likely to occur. The war has also exacerbated gender imbalances in the population, as a large proportion of those who fled the country were women and children, while many men stayed behind due to conscription and the need to defend the country. This has led to a significant gender imbalance among those remaining in Ukraine, particularly in areas affected by the conflict. The war has intensified the trend of an aging population in Ukraine. Many of those who have left are of working age, which has reduced the total proportion of younger people remaining in Ukraine. This aging demographic poses long-term challenges for Ukraine, including a shrinking labour force and increased pressure on social services and pensions. Before the conflict, Donetsk Oblast had a population of around 4.3 million people, which was the most populous oblast in the country. However, due to the war and the large-scale displacement, the population is estimated that around 2 million people still remain living in the Donetsk Oblast. Looking at the Luhansk Oblast, before the breakout of conflict in 2014, this oblast had a population of around 2.2 million. Zaporizhia Oblast, before the conflict in 2022, had a population of around 1.7 million. In Crimea, the population stands at around 2 million. And in the final oblast under Russian occupation, Kherson, the total population of the oblast stood at around 1 million before the outbreak of the full invasion in 2022. It is hard to predict the future of Ukraine's population demographics as the battle lines of the war continue to move. Let's imagine, therefore, Ukraine's new borders are laid out under the territory that it currently directly controls. Ukraine would have a population of 31 million. This in turn would make the country the world's 50th most populous country. Estimating the total number of refugees that would return to Ukraine in this scenario is difficult, although estimates suggest that around 5 million refugees are likely to remain outside of the country as the war is dragged on and refugees have become settled in host countries. Another problem for Ukraine is shown here on the population pyramid. Here we can see clearly the starkness of Ukraine's demographic issues. We can see the steep decline in young 20 to 35-year-olds as this generation was born within a period of fertility decline in Ukraine. It is also a generation that has experienced a large amount of emigration, which was only intensified by the refugee crisis, as this generation disproportionately represented a large amount of refugees that have fled Ukraine or has been sent to fight in the war. The older population, as time moves on, will increasingly need to be supported by a younger population that cannot sustain them. This will result in a massive aging crisis in Ukraine that has already begun and will likely be replicated across other European countries, although Ukraine will have one of the older populations on the continent. There are a number of estimates we can use to forecast the future population makeup of Ukraine. Please remember that this is a scenario where the current battle lines within the war in Ukraine are established as the new borders of Russia and Ukraine. So, within this scenario, the population of Ukraine in 2030 will remain one of the oldest in Europe and will amount to approximately 35 million people under the most optimistic scenario, and 30 million under the most pessimistic scenario. By 2040, the population may further decline to 28 million, and then by 2050 to 25 million if current rates are sustained. This would mean that the population of Ukraine would halve between 1993 and 2050, looking much further ahead, and the population could dip below 20 million by 2080 and could reach 17 million by 2100. This matters. Ukraine is one of the largest countries in Europe, even if the territory currently seized by Russia is lost. A country of this size being sustained by a population of 25 million by mid-century is going to run into trouble, particularly as the population by this time will be significantly older. Over one-third of the population by 2050 could be over the age of 60, which creates a heavy top-down dependency for younger Ukrainians to support this generation. Now, what can Ukraine do? Well, it's very difficult to reverse population decline, as we have seen throughout the world. In neighbouring Hungary, we have seen the government grant significant tax breaks to families with a large number of children, although even this has failed to fully reverse that country's population decline. Immigration is often used as a tool to sustain population growth, particularly in Western Europe. However, Ukraine is a poor country by European standards, and this is unlikely to change in enough time to reverse a mass population decline in the country in the short term. Immigrants will likely continue to offer richer Western nations over Ukraine, even if their economy begins to recover. A baby boom is also unlikely. Ukraine had one of the lowest fertility rates in Europe even before the war. The fertility rate before the full invasion in 2022 was around 1.2 children per woman, which is well below the replacement level of 2.1. The ongoing conflict, economic uncertainty, and displacement have further depressed birth rates, with some suggesting that the fertility rate today is as low as 0.7. So what can be said to end all of that, negativity? The Ukrainian people have shown remarkable resilience in the face of adversity. This resilience could be a driving force for the country's recovery and development in coming years. The strong sense of national identity and patriotism, which has been reinforced during the conflict, could encourage many Ukrainians to contribute actively to the nation's rebuilding efforts, including starting or expanding families as a symbol of hope and renewal. It remains to be seen what might happen, but it could act as a further point of interest for other European states which face the same problems. Again, I'm sorry that the video was very negative and not very humorous, but the topic at hand didn't really require that. I hope to go back to more softer topics going forward and hope to see you there. Thank you.